welcome back to Faces of Truth, where we attempt to help Americans think for themselves again, and in the process, bring truth to the minds of humanity. My name's Alexander McCauley. During the next few minutes, I hope to cover a topic that seems to be rather sensitive in Washington right now. That's whether or not carbon dioxide is a devil or an angel in the atmosphere. Our atmosphere on Earth is comprised of, I think it was 61% oxygen, mostly nitrogen, with trace amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases. About 10,000 years ago, according to the geologic time scale, we had a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and at that particular period of time, places like Egypt were flourishing gardens, had foliage, or profusion of foliage, etc. Only in 600 BC, Missouri had wild rainforests growing in it. How do we know this? From historical records and from ice cores taken in Antarctica and in Greenland. Ice that was laid down around 10,000 BC has a higher concentration of CO2 than ice laid down during the period of time that the Great Plague of the Dark Ages, the Black Plague, broke out. Many people, or the scholars, have actually concurred that the Black Plague was a direct result of the onset of an ice age that was brought on by the eruption of a volcanic eruption during that period of time. What we see in history that carbon dioxide does when it gets more profuse in the atmosphere is that, yes, it does warm up the planet. But we also see some interesting contradictions to what the models say. There's a transition period. I will talk about the transition period in a future episode, but right now we want to know exactly what happens when the temperature heats up. Most of the models only go 2 to 4 to maybe 7 years past when the globe starts to heat up. And this is what I call the transition period. We'll cover that in another episode. But this episode, I do want to talk about a few of what I call the myths of climate change. One myth of climate change is that of perpetual water acidification. They use water acidification as a terror word to get you afraid that your water is going to become acid. Basically, it's just another way of saying water desalinization, or the dilution of the briny water in the ocean. This happens from the melting of the ice caps on Earth. This according to these people, will raise sea level about 10 to maybe 100 feet. If it's just 10, it'll inundate the coastal cities. But we can build seawalls, we can build buildings with sealed lower levels, etc., etc. I mean, humanity has literally adapted to anything that's been thrown at us by Mother Nature since the beginning of time. As time goes on and temperatures begin to heat up, we get more water vapor saturation in the atmosphere. Now, Art Bell, a former radio personality, wrote a book called The Coming Global Superstorm that indicates that more temperature differential is made the hotter the temperature on Earth gets. Which causes extreme cold weather to come down from the north. My data says otherwise. As the atmosphere gets saturated with water vapor from the evaporating oceans, water acts as a heat sink, shunting hotter temperatures off to colder latitudes, spreading the temperature more evenly across the planet. Also, as carbon dioxide increases, the carbon dioxide gets to higher and higher altitudes. So more topology on Earth is reached by life-giving carbon dioxide. Plants breathe carbon dioxide. They split off the carbon and exhale the oxygen during their photosynthesis cycle. The carbon dioxide is converted into sugars and O2, or the oxygen we breathe. So the more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the more oxygen in the atmosphere. The higher the level of the carbon dioxide, the more saturation in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide, the higher it gets up mountains, etc., etc. So the higher plants can survive. Now, with more water vapor in the atmosphere and more carbon dioxide saturation, we find the higher up mountains moisture gets, and the further over mountains moisture can go to water the other side. In Missouri, we find that a lot of the times our winds will be coming in from I believe sometimes we get easter winds. The last few weeks we've been getting westerly winds. Or winds coming in from the west. And when winds come in from the west, the east side of a mountain will get no rain. But as the winds blow over the Great Plains area, water evaporates and creates new clouds to water the Midwest. So all of the water is wrung out of the clouds, out of the sky, on the windward side of the Rockies towards the west coast when we've got a westerly wind. And everything on the eastern side of the Rockies gets no rain. So the west side got all the rain, the east side got none of it. However, you get more carbon dioxide, you get hotter weather, which then evaporates more water, keeping it suspended for longer periods of time in the sky, but at lower levels, so that it condenses on things closer to the ground, but there's more of it in the air, so it can more effectively and efficiently reach every end of the globe. So there are two things you need for good growth, good plant growth. Oh, actually, three things. There's carbon dioxide, water, nitrates, and nutrients. The more carbon dioxide you get in the atmosphere, the more breathable material for plants is out there. Also, the more water vapor saturates the atmosphere, giving us more arable land. We can grow at higher altitudes, we can grow in deserts because now water is getting into the desert, where it can saturate the sands and plants can start growing. Those that chiefly need silica they can go through their life cycle, decompose, and start building up loam layers, etc. Now, as the environment starts to warm up, we see sea levels actually start to go down because more of the oceans are actually being evaporated into the atmosphere. Now, as the ocean recedes, it becomes saline. The areas of the coastal regions that it has receded from will be saline, so you'll have to, or in order to cultivate that, we'll have to wait for the mists that went forth upon the face of the earth, the extremely saturated atmosphere, water, to cleanse those pieces of land, parcels of land, which will then be arable as well, cultivatable. The acidification of the water, the desalinization, the environmental alarmists say would be a bad thing because we'd end up with saltwater species going extinct. But the thing is, we all know this little principle called evolution that science likes to sort of force feed us when it's convenient for them. And all things adapt. Basically, the principle states that all things adapt to their environment. And all environments will adapt to what is introduced into them. So, the law of evolution is the principle of adaptation. Now, it's still under debate whether I can evolve into something else or my cat can evolve into me. But there are changes that happen within a species to allow them to survive, however their environment is changed. For instance, in a warmer environment, new species migrate north. These are species that might not get along with native species. This is another thing that they keep on saying, ringing alarm bells for. But the thing is, species are designed to adapt to new species coming in, adapt their behaviors, etc., etc. Unfortunately, the dodo didn't do that when the dingo was introduced to the Australian continent. But most life forms will adapt to any predator that moves in due to climate change. Certain plants dying out. This is impossible because most alpines, even though they have adapted to low moisture and colder climates, will have a decent chance of surviving in a more temperate to tropical climate. We find more susceptibility towards fungi and bacterial infections that existed in tropical regions. But the thing is, as I said, we're sort of denying the fact that even plants adapt to the new microbial predators to make sure that their species, their variety, survives. We have so many. The point I'm trying to make with this this particular presentation is that as carbon dioxide rises in an atmosphere, if you have a coherent electromagnetic field protecting the atmosphere from being stripped off by solar radiation, you actually end up with a more bountiful environment than you do in cooler conditions. For instance, let's see, about, I think it was about 3,000, I think so, years ago, a mini ice age started, and the Sahara Desert inundated a great deal of the Egyptian territory. What we find in reality is that the cooler the temperatures at the North and the South Pole, the more extreme the weather conditions. You get an extremely cool polar regions, and you get an extremely hot equatorial region. Or, no, the equatorial region doesn't change for the most part. When you get a rise in temperature, more water vapor enters the atmosphere instead of being locked in oceans that are practically useless because they have too high a salt content. And that water spreads the equatorial conditions more evenly across the entire planet. You still have cooler poles, but the equatorial heat is literally warming those poles. Cooler air from the poles does continue to sweep toward the equatorial region, but the warmer air circulates toward the polar regions. And in doing so, it constantly is in the atmosphere is in a process of seeking for an equilibrium. It wants to achieve equilibrium. That's what makes wind and drives weather systems, is that search for equilibrium. It wants all of its surface area to be the same temperature. But because the sun cooks the equatorial regions, and there's not enough air, there's not enough water in the atmosphere to circulate that equatorial heating, we find ourselves getting colder and colder the farther from the equator we get. The more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, allegedly the hotter the equator gets, because we hold on to more heat. But the more heat we hold on to, the less ice cubes in the north and the south we get, and the glaciers melt, which basically keeps the material that keeps the poles so cold down. It brings down that albedo beta reflection and returns the water to a more usable form. When the environment starts to heat up at the North Pole and the South Pole, obviously a little bit of a sea level rise, but nothing that worries the insurance companies. Later on you see that water starts to saturate the atmosphere and sea levels start to retreat, because more water can be absorbed into the atmosphere because of the temperature. As this water is evaporated into the atmosphere, you get saline levels that are comfortable for the ocean life. You get water saturation that starts to even out the global temperature. You can grow crops at higher latitudes as well as higher altitudes. Eventually, because of the greater moisture content of the atmosphere, more solar radiation is, more ultraviolet and infrared radiation from the sun is blocked out, and photo radiation is allowed through, meaning less cancers, less deterioration of your cell, tissue, etc. So a healthier environment, radiation-wise. More food, healthier people, more water available, more fresh water available in a higher volume across the world. Deserts shrink because now they've got the resources they need to support vegetation, and you end up with a flourishing world. That is, the more carbon dioxide you have in the atmosphere. As science continues to progress, those who take a climate alarmist stance are ever more disproven in their assumptions concerning climate. It's proven through historical and ice core data that warmer global climates actually increase the bounty of Earth, whereas deserts expand when water is wrung out of Earth's atmosphere due to colder temperatures. We have to search for the truth and adopt it. This is the goal of this program. If you enjoyed the content of this episode, please like, subscribe, follow my page on Facebook. Make sure to ring the bell so every time I post, you'll get the notification. And leave some comments. I mean, I don't care if you kind of side with the